otherwise. And now it's time to introduce our speaker. Helen Zoe Veit is an associate professor of history at Michigan State University. She specializes in American history in the 19th and 20th centuries, focusing on the history of food and nutrition. She is now writing a book entitled Picky: How American Children Became the Pickiest Humans in History, which explains the rise of mass childhood pickiness during the last 200 years. That sounds like a really interesting book. Her first book, Modern Food, Moral Food, Self-Control Science and the Rise of Modern American Eating in the Early 20th Century, explored the origins of modern eating, and it was a finalist for the 2014 James Beard Award for Reference and Scholarship. She directs the What America Ate Project, a digital archive and interactive website focusing on American eating during the Great Depression, which is funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities. She has edited 3 volumes of the American Food and History book series for Michigan State University Press. First volume in the series, Food in the Civil War Era, the North, won Gourmand's International Award for Best Series Cookbook, published in the U.S. in 2014, and it was a finalist for the 2015 award in food history from the International Association of Culinary Professionals. The second volume, Food in the Civil War Era, the South, came out in spring 2015, and the third volume, and the topic of today's talk, Food in the American Gilded Age, came out in spring 2017. So, without further ado, please welcome Helen Zoe Veit.
Thank you so much to everyone for being here today. Thank you to Glenda for inviting me. Thank you to the culinary historians for having me. I'm truly honored to be here, and I'm really excited to talk about a topic that I find endlessly fascinating, which is food in the Gilded Age. Gilded Age banquets were not light. Take, for example, the banquet held by the Daughters of the American Revolution in honor of Washington's birthday in 1894. Diners started with oysters and horseradish, followed by clear calf's head soup, followed by olives and celery and pickled peppers. These 3 courses were the merest hint of what was to come. Next came lobster patties, followed by a shad caught in the Potomac River, with Saratoga chips, a kind of fried potatoes, followed by capon, which is a rooster that was castrated in its youth to make the meat more tender, along with smoked pig jowl and spinach. Still, the eaters were only getting warmed up. Next came larded sweetbreads, followed by succotash with French peas, followed by a beef fillet with potatoes and mushrooms, followed by orange fritters. And more was still to come. Much more. There was roast turkey, then prime rib with cranberries, then a course of stewed tomatoes, and then a pause. Were they done? Not remotely. This was merely a break for a palate-cleansing kirsch punch. Diners drank the punch, dabbed their lips, then plunged into more courses. Pheasant with grape jelly, bread sauce similar to a Thanksgiving stuffing, chicken salad, bone turkey, and a green salad. Finally, the desserts began to arrive. Plum pudding with cognac sauce, Neapolitan ice cream and assorted cakes, mince and cherry pies, all followed by fruits and champagne jelly. Now were they done? Close, but not quite. At long last, the after-dessert savory courses appeared. Cheeses and crackers, nuts and raisins, and finally, black coffee. A Gilded Age banquet like this one would have taken hours. 3 hours was not unheard of. 3 hours was typical, but 5 hours was not unheard of. And it would have been exhausting, even for those who most enjoyed it. On the most basic level, how do you manage to eat it all? Advice writers warned banquet goers on this very point. Even the most voracious appetite must be satisfied with a little of each. In other words, to still have room for even a single nut that would arrive at the end of the banquet, a diner could have no more than small tastes of everything all night. Of course, this would have entailed great waste, with plate after plate of exquisite, carefully prepared food sent back to the kitchen mostly uneaten. But waste was part of the point. Nowhere more nakedly than at a banquet did wealthy Americans show off their ability to command resources for their own pleasure, to select the very choicest morsel from a choice dish, and to leave most of the expensive food for the slop bucket or the servants. And servants were absolutely necessary to pull off a feast like this one. Not only to cook the food, which was a Herculean task, but multiple people were needed to bring in every new course, to clear previous courses away, to quietly wash dishes, to be on hand to attend to the smallest need. Gilded Age feasting involved a superabundance of food and alcohol, long stretches of leisure time, and it showed off diners' ability to command and to be waited upon. They are the most stunning examples of what the sociologist Thorstein Veblen famously described as conspicuous consumption in his 1899 masterwork, The Theory of the Leisure Class. Conspicuous consumption means how people both display and reinforce their social positions by what they buy or they eat or they wear. It's not an accident that this phrase was coined in the Gilded Age. And it was a Gilded Age, not a Golden Age. Gilded, of course, means something that's painted or coated with gold, but that is not actually made of gold. Mark Twain coined the phrase, and his name stuck because so many people shared his sense that the glamorous exterior of the era hid far less savory realities. If you scratch the glinting surface, stark contrasts emerge. Most obvious of all, it was an era of gross income inequality, and the lavish food and glamorous clothing and physical ease enjoyed by a few contrast painfully with the hunger and poverty suffered by so many others. In the US South, in the Gilded Age, the dismal failures of Reconstruction after the Civil War had led to systemic poverty among African Americans and exploding racial violence. In the rural South, sharecroppers and tenant farmers, many of whom were deeply in debt because of the twisted sharecropping system itself, had some of the least sufficient diets of all, with an overwhelming reliance on cornmeal and routine protein deficiencies. Sharecroppers supplemented their meager diets as they could, and observers reported people hunting muskrats, possum, sometimes snakes for food. Life on the Western Plains during the Gilded Age was transforming revolutionarily. Indigenous people were fighting and dying in the last Indian wars, and war and displacement and the mass in-migration of outsiders was changing ecosystems that resulted in completely transformed indigenous foodways. For example, a Sioux boy named Luther Standing Bear, and this is an image from the white artist George Catlin of some Sioux people from the mid-19th century. This Sioux boy named Luther Standing Bear was proud to kill his first buffalo when he was around 8 years old in the 1870s in land that would later be considered northern Nebraska. But his first buffalo turned out to be his last buffalo, because even as he was learning to ride and hunt alongside his male relatives, white settlers were slaughtering buffalo by the tens of millions, driving them to the brink of extinction. Zitkala Saw, a girl of the Yankton Sioux who was born in the 1870s in land that would later be called South Dakota, was lured to an Indian boarding school at age 8 by white missionaries who gave her candy and chewing gum. But the lonesome reality of life in the austere Quaker school and the unfamiliar foods she encountered there, like boiled turnips, made her heart sick. In the 1890s, a Hopi boy named Chuka, who was born in what is now northern Arizona, loved chilies and vegetables and wild plants and a wide variety of meats. He ate chipmunk and porcupine and bluebird and coyote and fox and bear and goat testicles and much more. But he didn't like everything. He was reluctant to eat the bland wheat bread and other foods of the white people, as he said, that his people were seeing more and more of in the 1890s. Meanwhile, white settlers and other settlers in the West, not all of whom were white, sometimes also experienced terrible want. This is a photograph of a widower with his 3 children in Nebraska in the 1880s. It was in 1881 that Laura Ingalls, who would later have fame from Little House on the Prairie books, that she almost starved to death along with her family and other Western settlers when the Dakotas experienced one of the snowiest winters on record, and trains were unable to get through with food or coal for months. Other food catastrophes also beset Western settlers, including dramatic crop failures. A girl named Edna Rapp was a child in late 19th century Kansas when a plague of grasshoppers moved through and devoured all the crops over a period of weeks. In hungry desperation, Edna and other children caught and ate all of the grasshoppers they could. And of course, these extremes of wealth and want played out in Americans' bodies. Whether they lived on the Nebraska plains or a Mississippi cabin or a New York tenement, poor Americans were shorter and thinner than their better-fed counterparts. Thinner probably makes sense, although of course today, as you may know, the poorest Americans, those most likely to be food insecure and chronically hungry, are much more likely to be obese than wealthy Americans. This has to do with the weirdness of our modern food system. For all eras in the past, poor people were much more likely to be thin. As for shortness, why were they short? It was because they didn't get enough food during their childhood growth spurts. So when they needed calories to fuel growth, they didn't have them. They were not maximizing their potential height. This meant that if you had been a poor child, your childhood poverty was visible your entire life. And we see, looking a couple of decades ahead to World War I, when there was a draft starting in 1917, more than a third of otherwise eligible men were rejected from military service, mainly because of physical reasons, most commonly that they were too short or too scrawny. So we can trace many of the draft rejections of World War I to childhood poverty in the Gilded Age. Poor people in Gilded Age America also regularly suffered from diseases of malnutrition. Some had pellagra, which means angry skin in Italian. It's caused by not getting enough protein, and it causes people's skin to just open up in giant weeping sores. It's terribly painful. And many also had rickets, which is a vitamin D deficiency that causes bones to soften and bend. Nutrition science was just starting to emerge in the Gilded Age, and people didn't yet understand what caused these diseases of malnutrition, and they didn't know about vitamins. But that didn't stop dietary reformers from studying other people's diets and telling them how they were eating wrong. For example, one poor German immigrant family in 1890s New York mainly ate bread and pasta and potatoes, as well as sometimes cheap cuts of meat and canned milk and some vegetables and occasional cake and jelly. Their food cost 13 cents per person per day, which is a little more than $1 a day today. But that was not cheap enough for the dietary reformers who were studying them. Jelly and cake were luxuries, not necessities, and reformers urged this family to spend their money differently, to cut out all treats and to focus on one thing and one thing only, which was getting as much filling food as possible for the least amount of money. In the Gilded Age, poor Americans spent more than half of their incomes on food, and the average for all Americans was about 40%. Today, it's around 10%, but again, this is actually historically very weird that we spend such a small amount today. And Americans are unusual. Globally, people are actually closer to Americans' expenditures 100 years ago. Of course, for Americans at the very bottom, people who had little education or who were sick or disabled or who had been born into slavery or who for 1,000 reasons were at the very bottom, it was cruelly hard to break out of poverty, no matter how cheaply they ate. While poor Americans were often small, wealthy Americans were often big. The multiple courses of rich food at every meal were resulting in paunches and double chins among some people, making the bloated fat cat physique synonymous with the excesses of capitalism. And I want to stress how unusual it was to be overweight at this time. Of course, we've just talked about the very poorest Americans who were thin, but most Americans in the Gilded Age were not desperately poor. And most Americans did have enough food at the time. The United States was the most abundant country in the world, and most Americans had enough to eat. But even if you had plenty to eat, it was much harder to gain excess weight than it is for us today. Most Americans still lived and worked on farms, and even people who lived in towns or cities usually did physical activity or manual labor routinely as part of their day. So they were expending a lot of calories. At the same time, highly processed food didn't yet exist. It would soon. By the early 1900s, we see highly processed products like Crisco appearing, but not yet. And the calorie-dense foods that existed were things like pastry and ice cream and bacon, things that were mainly animal products that were more expensive. So people tended to eat less of them for economic reasons, even if they had them sometimes, which meant many Americans were eating mainly plants, grains and vegetables and legumes. Sometimes they consumed those plants in the form of beer or cider or other alcohols. But the point is that most Americans ate a plant-forward diet as a matter of course. And obesity was so rare that it was a curiosity. This is a man named Diamond Jim Brady, a wealthy man who was famous across the country for his big appetites and big paunch. It's no wonder, looking at such contrast, that Thorstein Veblen saw wealthy banquets as conspicuous consumption. And I want to talk a little more about banquets, both because they were such an important way that the powerful displayed their power, and because they weren't only about symbolism, they were also very clearly about the food itself. A Gilded Age banquet was a sensual event on a major scale. There was a mania for French cooking styles in this era, which ensured a lot of butter and cream and eggs and meat and pastries. And the food at most banquets would have been absolutely delicious. For formal banquets, it was a fad of the era to make souvenir copies of the menu. And one reason was so that diners could take them home and years later remember the delights of the evening. Now, if you scan dozens and dozens of these banquet menus, as I have, you see that they almost always followed a really rigid structure. Virtually always, they began with oysters, often blue points harvested from the northeastern United States, which were firm and briny. Next, almost always came a clear soup, like a consommé, or sometimes a turtle soup. But if you couldn't get turtle, you could make a mock turtle soup, which was made with meat from a calf's head, which was said to resemble turtle. Mock turtle soup was so common in the 19th century that the writer Lewis Carroll winkingly created a character in Alice's Adventures in Wonderland called the mock turtle, which had the body of a turtle and the head of a calf. After soup, there was usually a course of raw vegetables like celery or radishes with pickles or olives, a kind of light, fresh course. And then there was just this huge series of fish and game and meat courses, like I read to you at the beginning, interspersed with vegetables. So many of them that there was regularly that kind of palate cleansing pause with either a punch or a sorbet, something to give diners a moment to digest. For dessert, after the meat and fish, very often there was Neapolitan ice cream. This was an obsession of the Gilded Age. I wasn't sure why at first. I still don't know definitively, but I'm guessing, one, ice cream at a time when out-of-season ice was a luxury was itself sort of conspicuous consumption. But two, it had these layers, so it's beautiful at a time when that was prized, and also the layers made it complicated, so it seemed sophisticated and ornate. Ice cream was usually flanked by all sorts of other cakes and fruits, and then often followed by cheeses and nuts and dried fruits. And then black coffee. Black coffee was the inevitable finale. And it had to be black because it was a truism among elite diners that to put cream in coffee after dinner was vulgar. The black coffee rule was only one of many rigid conventions that underlay Gilded Age fine dining. And what if you didn't know that rule? What if you asked for cream in your coffee after dinner? Well, that was only one that made fitting in very difficult for new people. And there were a lot of new people in Gilded Age America, meaning people who were new to a particular place or a particular social class. That was because there was a lot of geographic mobility, many people moving west, many farmers moving to cities, lots of immigration. And despite the many problems that made it hard to move out of poverty, there was a lot of social mobility as well. In other words, people moving up or sometimes down the social ladder. The middle class was expanding, and controlled, mannered eating was a very important part of establishing middle class propriety. But eating and dining were even more important for those attempting to become part of the elite. One of the biggest stumbling blocks for those hoping to appear at ease in upper class settings was French. French was ubiquitous on American menus during the Gilded Age. For example, if you look at the menu that I showed you a moment ago, first just look at the illustrations. This is for the New England Society dinner, their annual dinner in 1882, and it featured nostalgic illustrations of a pewter tankard and a man in breeches and a cauldron on an open fire. And you might guess that they would be eating baked beans and cod and corn dodgers. But no, the menu is entirely in French, or almost entirely in French. And it follows the same rigid structure as the banquets that I have already described. Not every menu in the Gilded Age contained French, but a stunning number of them did. In fact, even the word menu is French. It comes from the French menu, and it was in the Gilded Age that it became part of everyday Americans' vocabularies. It replaced the English phrase bill of fare, which people had previously used. And lots of other words entered Americans' vocabularies from the French, cooking words or food words. Mayonnaise, casserole, sauté, chef, cuisine, lots and lots entered our vocabulary during the Gilded Age because of this fascination. The fact that only privileged and highly educated Americans, for the most part, would have spoken French increased its value as a social testing ground. And not having a passing familiarity with French could instantly expose someone as a social pretender. In part because of its associations with money and power and elegance, the popularity of French only increased during the Gilded Age. And by the 1890s, you can find mainly French menus showing up in very humble restaurants. Why was French so widely appealing? Or to put it another way, why did pomme croquette sound so much better to American ears than apple patties? One reason might be that the decades after the Civil War were such a tumultuous time. There was breakneck industrialization and urbanization, there was swelling immigration, and major technological and social shifts that could be quite frightening. Americans were suffering from a collective lack of confidence in the soundness of their own customs, both culinary and in lots of other ways. And in large numbers, Americans looked to Europe as the source and the standard of fine food and good manners. They do this in Europe, one etiquette writer wrote typically in 1894, so that it cannot be laughed at as ridiculous. Throughout the Gilded Age, writers enthusiastically described European habits, German styles of proposing a toast or Russian styles of serving food, and pushed for their adoption, often on the sole grounds that they were European. English aristocracy held a special appeal. Middle-class American magazines like Ladies' Home Journal and Everyday Housekeeping regularly printed descriptions of the everyday lives of monarchs or other aristocrats, and advertisements routinely featured kings or queens, whether or not the product had any relationship whatsoever to monarchy. And this fascination shows up in recipes too. We see recipe titles, things like Duchess potatoes, royal custard, potage à la reine, and consommé à la royale. One of Americans' favorite ways to imitate the English, especially aristocrats, was through afternoon tea. Afternoon teas became very fashionable in the Gilded Age, both among the very wealthiest Americans and among middle-class people. Americans didn't always know what a genuine tea meant in England, so they did lots of different things. Teas were sometimes small social gatherings, sometimes they were big parties. Americans served all kinds of things at teas, ranging from tea and cookies to a kind of brunchy meal to a massive buffet with all kinds of meats and pickles and sandwiches. What was consistent in teas was that they were relatively informal compared to other social meals. So there wouldn't have been place settings or a formal procession to dinner, and there wouldn't have been servants in the room. That was something people talked about a lot. Instead of servants serving the people who were at the table, the hostess was supposed to pour the tea or the coffee. Americans drank a lot of coffee at afternoon teas because they loved coffee in this era. She was pouring them herself. Guests served themselves food. This was seen as novel by the richest Americans. Of course, middle-class Americans didn't have footmen in the dining room in the first place. But imitating wealthy Americans, who in turn were imitating European aristocrats, was a way to display status and knowledge in a rapidly changing society. The trick was knowing what to do. Both geographic and social mobility fueled a demand for advice about behavior. Many Americans found themselves navigating new social worlds in which they could no longer rely on family connections or established reputations, so manners became shorthand for experience and class. Advice on manners was such a powerful social tool that you see dozens and dozens of these etiquette books appearing in the Gilded Age, aimed at all kinds of different people. For people who had grown up in really modest circumstances and were trying to become a middle-class American, etiquette writers gave very specific instructions about which actions were acceptable and which were embarrassingly incorrect. Things like don't scratch vigorously in public, don't pick your teeth with your knife, don't wipe your mouth on the tablecloth. These seem funny to us because they're so obvious, but they were new rules to some people at this time. And the higher you went up the social ladder, the more elaborate and complicated rules got. Precisely because the Gilded Age was this time of rapid industrialization, there were some people who were newly wealthy and who needed help navigating the intimidatingly complex and often unspoken rules of highest society. People called them the nouveau riche, or arrivistes, or swells, or silver gilts, or just shoddy. Whatever you called them, the newly arrived were desperate to fit in. In the most elite enclaves of Gilded Age America, especially in New York and Newport, it wasn't enough to have a lot of money. You had to be seen as the right kind of person, someone who was tasteful and educated, someone who seemed to belong. This is a portrait of the Vanderbilt family in the 1870s. The Vanderbilts are possibly the most successful social climbers in history. Social climbing was precarious. Edith Wharton, the famous novelist who herself had grown up incredibly privileged in old New York, called high New York society a small and slippery pyramid. If you make a mistake, you fell hard and fast. Knowing elite rules about manners and food and clothes was all the more difficult because they were supposed to seem natural. Gilded Age etiquette guides, aimed at the most ambitious social climbers, spelled out elaborate codes of conduct, telling readers how and when to present calling cards, how and when to stand or to sit, when to rise or bow, when to offer one's hand or one's name, and when not to offer it, when to wear gloves, when to take them off, when to change clothes, and 1,000 other particulars that were supposed to seem inborn. Table manners were especially tricky because eating is an inherently physical act. As one etiquette writer lamented, eating is a requirement of our lower nature, and we should try to invest our manner of eating with enough refinement and delicacy to distinguish us from the brute. In other words, table manners help distinguish us from animals. This is still true. Etiquette writers returned to this idea again and again and warned diners to do everything they could to seem refined. For example, take small mouthfuls, one writer advised. Chew slowly with the lips closed. There was a strong and unappetizing suggestion of animalism in the society at breakfast or dinner of the man or woman who smacks, grinds his or her food noisily between the teeth, regards with eager glance the contents of the plate, drains off a glass of water, and sips coffee and soup with a loud hissing sound. Note the emphasis here, and in many other guides of the era, on noise and speed and eagerness. These were the cardinal sins of Gilded Age dining. So how do you avoid them? You were supposed to eat very, very carefully. For one thing, you were supposed to eat virtually silently, without chewing noisily or slurping, without scraping your hair or breathing audibly or clattering your silverware. Gilded Age Americans placed thick mats under their tablecloths in order to muffle the sound of dishes. Some people had their servants wear slippers so that you wouldn't hear their footsteps as they approached. You were also supposed to eat, besides silently, slowly. A lot of Gilded Age table manners were about slowing people down. They were intentionally anti-efficient. For example, it is more efficient to lean forward and to shovel your food towards your mouth, but Gilded Age manners said, nope, you sit up straight, you have a good distance from your food, and you should spoon your food away from you when you eat. It is more efficient to load up your fork while you're still chewing your previous bite, but they said, no, you must always calmly chew and swallow, and then pick up your fork to begin again. If your soup or your coffee is too hot, of course it's more efficient to blow on it or to stir it, but no, that was also against the rules. You were supposed to simply wait while it cooled. Finally, and this can seem quite strange to us, you weren't really supposed to show obvious pleasure in the food. You shouldn't say you were hungry, and you should not appear hungry. You should approach the food with relative detachment, always leaving something on your plate. Some etiquette writers even said you shouldn't say the food was delicious. That was too physical. Eating slowly and silently and calmly took a lot of self-control, but you also weren't supposed to ever reveal that it was an effort. When rich people dined, they were supposed to embody an ideal of leisure, showing everyone that they were above such physical concerns as hunger. You also weren't supposed to reveal that hosting was an effort. Edith Wharton, in her novel The Age of Innocence, describes a woman who always held her annual ball on an opera night on purpose so that she herself could go to the opera early in the evening and be seen by everyone to be there, relaxing, totally unconcerned with whatever preparations were going on in her own home. That was all done by servants. Then she would leave early, just a little early from the opera, and be there to receive her guests when they arrived. Meanwhile, if something went wrong at a formal dinner, for example, if someone spilled something or knocked over their wine glass, the rule was you don't apologize because you don't notice. Everyone at the table was supposed to pretend it had not happened, and a servant would come and clear it all away while they, just looked the other way. One way the Gilded Age diners tried to seem cultivated and refined was by using a lot of glassware and plates and other tableware. In particular, we see this profusion of specialized utensils in the Gilded Age with very specific tasks. Melon forks, olive forks, oyster forks, ice cream forks, really, lettuce spoons, really, spoons for lettuce, fish knives, aspic servers, the list goes on and on. They also used utensils to peel fruit. Fruit was particularly awkward. People noted uncomfortably that it seemed potentially suggestive of the human body. It also had these peels and these seeds and all of this waste. People were not supposed to eat the peel at this time. And there was just more and more fruit in the Gilded Age because of improvements in shipping and trains. So there was this unprecedented range of fresh fruits available, including not only fruits that had been popular in the mid-19th century, but increasingly tropical fruits by the late 19th century, like bananas and pineapples, and these became popular fare at formal dinners. Utensils helped people to mediate the awkwardness of fruit. And advice givers told people to peel them entirely with utensils, including very difficult fruits like oranges. You were supposed to peel entirely with a spoon and a knife. This is a high-stakes activity. I can just imagine oranges sometimes must have ricocheted down the table. The elite attitude to food, that you were at leisure, that you were not terribly impressed or concerned by anything, was perfectly exemplified in one of the most famous food books of the era, which is Mary Henderson's Practical Cooking and Dinner Giving. Mary Henderson was a wealthy woman and an experienced hostess. She was married to a man who had been a stock market investor and then became a capitalist, as he said. That's what he put on the census. He was a stock market investor who did very well. They lived in Washington, D.C., where they built something called Boundary Castle. And Henderson, in her book, went to great lengths to describe the ornate abundance of her life, while making clear that nothing was very grand by her standards. For example, after outlining the intricate steps involved in preparing a formal multi-course dinner, she wrote offhandedly, "It requires very little trouble to serve the dinner. It is a simple routine." She also blandly referred to the possibility of stamping personalized menu cards with a family crest. Here is one of the Vanderbilt crests. Crest was another way that Gilded Age Americans imitated Europeans. Of course, if you didn't happen to have a family crest, as most Americans did not, you could get one invented. Tiffany's, which existed back then, had a heraldry department during the Gilded Age where they would create family crests for people who wanted one. The formal meals that Mary Henderson described didn't just mean dinner. She described breakfast parties, which were big, elaborate meals with 6 or 7 courses and at least 1 or 2 wines. Her lunch parties were even more elaborate and alcohol-soaked. At one of her ladies' lunches, there were 12 courses and 3 different alcoholic drinks, and a course of chocolate, probably hot chocolate, but not clear, that was served in between courses of beef fillet and spinach on tongue. One of my favorite details is that Henderson titled her book Practical Cooking and Dinner Giving, when she knew full well that her advice was not remotely practical for most people. In calling her advice practical and such material excess simple, Henderson was making it clear that for her, having vast resources, sophisticated connections, and a staff of servants was absolutely ordinary. Her nonchalance about all this luxury was a way for her to show off that she was completely used to it. For the many Americans who were struggling to obtain adequate food, the prosaic title would have been laughable, if not obscene. But for newly rich people trying to figure out the complicated and largely unspoken rules that underlay elite behavior in the Gilded Age, detailed advice from Mary Henderson and other advice givers would have been valuable and even, to some extent, practical. Thank you very much. Sure, yeah, I can take questions if anyone has any.
Okay, so if anyone has any questions, just raise their hand. I'll bring the mic over to you.
Thank you. I noticed you didn't mention any wines. It only showed the men drinking out of a glass
That's
that
a great,
formal dinner, but
Yeah.
I didn't see it.
yeah, that's a great question. So alcohol was a major part of these banquets, mainly wines for the most part. And often banquet menus had specific wine pairings with specific courses. But as you probably know, this was also the time when the American temperance movement was gaining strength. By the 1910s, they would amend the Constitution to make the manufacture of intoxicating liquors illegal, which took major social support. So there was tension in this era between drinkers and non-drinkers to some extent. As far as gender goes, yes, women were more apt to be temperance reformers for a variety of reasons, and men were less likely to give up alcohol willingly. But a lot of women did drink in the Gilded Age. So it wasn't just that men were drinking and women weren't. Some men did support temperance. Some women, like Mary Henderson, who always talked about alcohol when she was giving menus, were enthusiastic drinkers as well.
You mentioned the French influence with all the immigration that was happening during the turn of the century. Was there German foods that were becoming popular or other ethnic
That's
foods?
a good question. So the demographics of immigration were also changing at this time. In the middle of the 19th century, in the 1840s and 50s and 60s, immigration was overwhelmingly Northern European, which included places like Germany and Ireland. That is still somewhat true for much of the Gilded Age, but by the 1890s, there are many more people from Southern and Eastern Europe coming. And in the west of the United States, there are people from Asia coming as well. German foods never really broke into the elite echelons. Like, you rarely see German foods, obvious German foods described on elite banquet menus. But German restaurants were relatively popular. There were not a lot of restaurants at the time, but there were German restaurants run by German immigrants. And we see foods like this special sandwich they had in Hamburg, which was chopped beef between two pieces of bread, which people increasingly called a hamburger, starting to become popular at the time. Or things like people from the Austro-Hungarian Empire, from Vienna, were having these sausages in a bun called a Wiener, or a Wiener, or a Wiener, or a hot dog. So we start to see some Germanic influence, but rarely in the most elite circles. And it's not clear exactly why, because the German Empire was also definitely seen as high culture. There were many Americans who studied German or who went, on continental tours and or went to universities in Germany. But for some reason, the food was never as exalted in American culture. And I'm not sure why. I don't know if it was somewhat less elaborate than French food, and so Americans just wanted the most complicated things they can get. I'm honestly not sure, but it's a great question.
Nobody else? On the day-to-day of the wealthy, I'm sure they didn't have all these courses. What was the typical dinner? Was it a 3-course dinner?
Yeah, that's a great question. So these banquets were, of course, not your average Tuesday for most people, but they would almost always have had courses at home. So wealthy Americans would have done a few things. One, they would have changed clothes for dinner. Wealthy Americans changed clothes frequently, and if you were going to change clothes only once a day, you would change clothes for dinner. So even some kind of aspiring middle-class people might have put on a fresh dress or changed clothes after work, for if someone had gone out of the house to work. There was often some sort of a soup to start with, and a main course, almost always meat for people who could afford it, and a dessert. So that was the basic course, on a daily dinner for a relatively wealthy American. That's a good question.
Okay, well, yeah. Sure. Not a problem.
So in these middle-class and upper-class homes, I'm assuming that the wife or the woman of the house would be the one who was really in charge of the food, and how would she direct set the menus and direct how the food was made?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in wealthy homes, servants prepared the food. There would have been at least a cook, possibly a cook and a housekeeper, and kitchen maids and scullery maids, depending on the size of the home and the wealth. In middle-class homes, it was quite common to have a servant. About 40% of Americans had a servant at the height of domestic service in this country, which was in the Gilded Age. But that was hard to maintain. For one thing, servant work in America was always really low status. It was always seen as sort of an option of last resort for people. Unlike in England, where I think among some people whose families had been in service for generations, it was seen as a somewhat more respectable career. In America, when there were better paying industrial jobs, people would leave their jobs as servants to go do that, even if it meant working in a factory for 14 hours a day. There was less oversight. Young women who were employed as domestic servants were vulnerable sometimes to unsavory advances or just to general exploitation for all servants. But all this to say, having a servant was relatively common, and in fact, many people saw that. Did you or did you not employ a servant as the definition of what it meant to be middle class? Because if you didn't, and you yourself was the one in the kitchen, the one scrubbing the floor, that you weren't middle class by definition. This was changing, however, because of the home economics movement. The home economics movement emerged in the Gilded Age largely in response to what people called the servant problem. Because if you have, a educated woman, someone who sees herself as someone with status and dignity, who does have to be the person scrubbing the floors and cooking the dinner, how do you professionalize that? How do you say this too is a skill, this is a form of family love that maybe is best performed by a family member? A lot of the language we have today about domestic work, and to some degree Americans' weird relationships with having a house cleaner today, come from the home economics movement saying this should be done by someone in the household. This was educated work that took an educated person to do well. And they could say that in part because all sorts of new advances were coming out from nutrition by the 1890s and 1900s. Things like calories and vitamins were emerging that people could say, oh, meal planning takes knowledge. Germ theory was emerging. People said, oh, you have to know about sanitizing pots and pans and washing your hands. So there were ways that science worked in tandem with the social problem and made housework seem like something that a middle-class woman could do. When women were working with servants, often women would plan menus, but sometimes even not. Sometimes even that seemed a little bit too in the trenches for the very wealthiest people, and they relied on a good chef working with a housekeeper to determine, almost certainly they would give a woman, the woman of the house, the menu for her approval, especially before a social event, but that might be the extent of it, of her involvement. Yeah.
Any other questions? Okay, if not, can we get another round of applause, please?
Thank you.
Yes, so thank you so much, Helen, for coming. This was fascinating. I knew it would be, and you did not disappoint. I just wanted to mention that next month our program is going to be online because our speaker will be Dr. Cindy Ott of the University of Delaware, and she has written a book called Pumpkin, The Curious History of an American Icon. So I hope you'll all tune in for that. That's Sunday, November 19th at 4 p.m., and you can find more information on our website, which is culinaryhistoriansanarbor.org. And now we hope you can stay, those of you who are here, and enjoy a taste of Gilded Age era macaroni pudding. And thank you very much for coming and watching, and enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you so much. Thank you, AADL.